Hey, everybody, and welcome to another week of the Whiskey Dictionary. I have a special guest on tonight, not his first time on the channel. This is Nick Taylor from Found North Whiskey. So, Nick, say hi.
Bill, I'm delighted to be here. I always am. So
Yeah.
thanks for having me again.
It's funny. Nick and I basically had to shut ourselves up because we were just chatting before the stream. Like it's always great having Nick on because he's a great conversationalist and knows a heck of a lot more about whiskey than I do. So I usually pretty much just sit back and like listen to Nick talk. But just want to say hi to everybody in the chat. Thank you guys for joining. As we kind of trickle in, we'll start talking a little bit more about the actual whiskey, but we'll give people a minute to get in here. So, Nick, why don't you tell me just a little bit about your, let's say, before Found Whiskey started? What are your credentials, if you want to call it that?
Ooh, yeah. So it's a really interesting because whiskey's not like wine, where you can have some formal training and go through the WSET and become a certified sommelier or anything like that. And as a result, unless you do something like go to Harriet Watt and get a degree in brewing and distilling, really the background of so many whiskey people is it's all over the place. And my background is completely wild. I was doing a startup with my brother in San Francisco years ago, and it didn't work. Which part of the reason why we ended up working together again. It was in the tech industry, and it's not interesting. But basically, while I was out living there, I really had been drinking whiskey for a while, and but well before I legally was allowed to, and a friend. Yeah, exactly, right. But my family was a family where, like, the glass of wine at night was actually sometimes, a little half pour of whiskey. Yeah, I know. Very fun. My dad and mom used to have dinner parties, and then after, my dad would pour himself, 2 fingers of scotch, and he used to say, "You get a fingernail," which I always thought was funny. But I had a small collection of scotch, and a friend came and visited me and said, "Holy cow, you've got this huge collection of scotch." My 8 bottles.
To be fair, many people that I go to their house when they don't know that I do this whole thing, if they think that they have a lot of bottles, it actually 8 seems about in that range. Like, I feel like maybe we're just a little skewed.
Yeah, no, right?
Like, this is not normal.
This is not normal, and I have 250 open bottles right now in the house. It's just ridiculous. Not to mention all of the cask samples that I have from our partner distillery. But
That's
basically,
a little bit since the last time we talked,
right? Yeah, it's gotten bigger. But basically, the person said to me, she said, "Do you think you could fake your way through a whiskey tasting?" And I was like, I don't know. I'm like in between jobs, trying to figure out what the hell to do with my life. And she was like, "Your whiskey budget for 4 bottles of whiskey is 10 grand." And I was like, I am in.
Wow.
I poured a really old Glendronach. I poured the first Rosebank. I didn't actually drink it, which drove me nuts because I had to go find it years later. But I poured a bunch of different, a Talisker 25, a bunch of crazy stuff. But I had to get ready for this tasting. So I just started reading everything I could. Mm-hmm. And I think one of the most interesting things for me was discovering that a lot of what I read wasn't accurate or true. And it just piqued a real interest with whiskey. I later that summer, I was talking to a friend who said, "You should really get into this whiskey thing. You seem to be taking it super seriously." And I said, "Yeah, I just don't know what to do." And he said, "Well, get off your butt and go to Scotland. Like, if you love Scotch, go to Scotland." And I said, "Well, what am I going to do in Scotland?" He said, "Just go. You'll figure it out."
Right.
So I booked a flight to Scotland. I booked a round trip, and I literally 1 month in Scotland, and I didn't book a single hotel, nothing. I landed, got online, and figured out where I was staying. I went to 40 distilleries in 30 days.
That's incredible.
Pretended to be a whiskey writer the whole time so I could talk to all the distillery managers and get all the extra drams. It was the drunkest month of my life. I was not 25, so I couldn't rent a car. which is probably a good thing. So I basically hitchhiked and walked from distillery to distillery because public
that's
transportation is sketchy. Yeah.
definitely before Uber would have been a thing. So yeah,
Exactly.
I love the concept of just being hammered and like asking people for rides and them giving it to you.
And Scotland's like that. You're just there like, oh, laddie, come on, get in the trunk. You're like, okay, where we
know where to find scotch.
Yeah, exactly right. But I came back and I sort of parlayed that trip into becoming a whiskey specialist for a chain of retailers in Massachusetts, which is Gordon's. And I did that for a couple of years. And then I found that I really loved doing tastings. I really loved learning about it. I really, really, really loved talking about it. And I convinced my brother to come take another swing at doing a company with me. And we started as whiskey brand ambassadors. And then eventually we sort of broadened into other spirits. We got an importing license. And then last year we made our big move to try to start a whiskey brand. So that's kind of my background in a nutshell.
Totally ballsy to do that. I just, it's funny because that was exactly the comment like a minute ago. And now I'm just like starting a distillery and we'll get to this. Starting a brand during a pandemic is just like, what, like I can't even envision the logistics of that. And what I think we should do just before we get into that is you and I should pour a drink because because it's always the best way to start. So we're going to talk. Actually, I should probably just kind of preface this. So that was Nick in a nutshell. But so because we have a few more people in here than we had a minute ago. So Nick and his brother started a brand of whiskeys, and he'll give you the pitch in a minute. But the idea was to make Canadian whiskey that is, what would you say, like way more approachable, kind of breaks the mold of what you would expect from Canadian, because I am not a Canadian whiskey fan at all.
Yeah.
But yeah.
I mean, and it makes sense, right? If you go into a liquor store, and you ask them where their Canadian section is, they probably don't know.
Like there's some Crown Royal over there.
Yeah. There was some crazy statistic I read. I don't know if it's actually true, but there was a survey done, and about 70% of Crown Royal drinkers think they're drinking bourbon, which is just wild, right?
I could totally see why though. Like, why would they think they were drinking anything else?
Yeah, and my attitude towards Canadian was always, I didn't know anything about it. Nobody was coming in and really trying to sell me Canadian whiskey when I worked in retail. And when I was in retail, the hottest thing on the market was Japanese whiskey, which has cooled off a little bit. But at the time it was like, but you'd be surprised how many whiskeys you're drinking are actually from Canada. I mean, the most famous is Whistle Pig. They really sort of changed the game for Canadian whiskey. And, but one of the most interesting sort of conversations we've had with some of the master blenders in Canada is they don't make whiskey like this, where it's cask strength, there's no additives, there's no caramel coloring. And I said, why don't you?
Right?
There's a ripe market in the US. And what was really interesting, the response I very frequently got was, one, the Canadian palate's very different from the American palate. They like just a different style of whiskey, and they cater to that whiskey in Canada. But two, the Canadian whiskey is incredible. Believe it or not, it's incredibly successful in the United States. From 1865 until 2010, it was the number one seller in the United States. Bourbon overtook it in 2010.
Was Canadian Canadian Club and maybe Seagram's or something, or?
Yeah, and I mean, Seagram's was a monster. And we'll get into this a little bit later.
Hold on, time out.
Yeah, go.
Let's pour.
Let's pour.
All right.
Yeah.
So what I mostly wanted to tell people. So we're going to drink a cask strength rye, right? So you guys, I swear I'm not just like kissing your ass, right? Like, it's more that you did stuff that I love and I have to let you know that. So the fact that you have right on the front, the mash bill and details about this, thank you. Like, it drives me crazy. You know, like, it's fine. It doesn't have to be on the front, but like when it's on the bottle, that is something I look for every time. And I'm always so happy when that happens. Because it's just like, I mean, I might have a different perspective. I usually like to provide that information in my videos, but I feel like just as anybody drinking something, especially if you see a 16-year-old whiskey and you're, you know, these aren't cheap, but like, I also kind of reasonably priced, honestly, for 16 years, but we'll go into that. Having all of that stuff right there and knowing what's in here is something I expect, frankly, from a premium whiskey. Like, I want with very little effort to know what's in the whiskey.
I love the word you just said, which was expect.
Yeah.
We like when you're building a brand, you talk about everything, right? Like, what's our ethos? What are the things we really care about? Mm-hmm. And I remember we were my brother and I were talking, and my brother said, you know, transparency, like everybody's talking about transparency as if it's this like this moral thing that they are aspiring to. And he was like, that's not us. Transparency should just be table stakes. You shouldn't be able to sell a whiskey that's over $100 and not give your audience, your consumers, a clue what's in it. It's just absurd, or where it's from, right? I mean, totally. It gets us totally heated. So I really love that you said that. Our feeling is that the context matters a lot, right? Mm-hmm. Like, we don't just drink whiskey. Obviously you drink whiskey for the taste, but you don't just drink whiskey for the taste, right? And I think like the coolest, one of the coolest moments in my career was I was hosting a really serious Scotch maker. He was releasing these really old Scotches, and I said to him, I said, you know, wow, congratulations, it was Stuart Lang, right? And it was the son of Douglas Lang. And I said, you're releasing these old Scotches. You must be so excited. And I won't try to do a Scottish accent, but he said, oh, laddie, these are not my whiskeys. I'm releasing my father's whiskeys. The whiskeys I really care about, I'll be dead by the time they're released. I just hope my sons raise a glass to me when they drink it. Mm-hmm. To this day, my hair stands up. Totally. But that's part of what's really cool. You know, people say like, oh, does age equal quality? No, of course, age doesn't automatically equate to quality. But when somebody releases a really old whiskey and you start to understand that maybe the guy who made it and laid it down is not even here anymore, is not even alive anymore, like that kind of context, just the age statement gives you that much, right? Yeah, and so
that's a really good point.
When you're thinking about whiskeys, you want to know what casket it's in. You want to know what the grains are. You want to know how it was aged. If without that, it's just the liquid. It's no longer the whole context, the whole story, the whole excitement around it. So it was for us. It was not something where we were going to come and say, let's pound the table about transparency. That's our whole ethos. It was, let's start there and then let's try to make it more interesting. Yeah. So.
You know, and something too, like when I first started this channel, one of the things that I was trying to kind of glom onto was the idea that like every distillery had some sort of story behind it. And I quickly came to learn that was not the case, like at all, unless of course they fabricated it. So I started kind of setting my expectations a bit different. And now my expectations, just as somebody who has been doing this for so many years, is this label. Like, that is what I want to know first. Like, Bruichladdich is great. Like, you can go, if you want to, you can go look at everything that they do, and what exactly is in your glass. And, you know, realistically, it's not like I might be able to say like, oh, there's a little bit more of this, or it aged a little bit longer, or whatever. And I might be able to think of that after I tasted it, but I don't know. Like something like a mash bill, I just expect that should be present. Like if you're dealing with 100% malted barley, like, okay, it's 100% malted barley, but mash bills matter a little bit more. So
the mash bill matters. And I think like, you know, I was very lucky. I got to taste a very, very old Fitzgerald the other day, the 1982 bottled in bond.
Okay.
Just an unbelievable bottle of whiskey, and it's a wheater, right? Yeah. You know, there's no rye in it, and yet it presents like pine needles and hay and mint and all of these things that we associate with a high rye mash bill. Mm-hmm. And just thinking about, you know, just thinking about Julian Van Winkle and that family making whiskeys that are presenting in a certain way as a wheater even just that little fact makes it more exciting for me. It's like, how do they
Yeah.
do this?
I was just gonna say that's very interesting because wheated bourbons do not typically, or even whatever. It's like they don't have any of those notes. Although it must be just it's sitting in the barrel for so long, it starts taking on. So that's really interesting. Huh.
I couldn't tell you how they do it. I think you know, they were Stitzel-Wellers. I could wax rhapsodic about Stitzel-Weller literally all night. But I guess it's probably a bad idea because I'm trying to talk about our whiskeys.
Yeah, I suppose. All right, so let's go ahead and have a taste of this, or at least let's at least smell this. So one of the things that typically in Canadian whiskeys I get, and I always get, is what I always consider like a fake caramel smell. And I've just found that either maybe it's from the column stills just doing what they do, or something about Canadian whiskeys. They all have a very specific flavor, even though they have other complexities, other notes, whatever. There's always something that just I could pick it out all the time. This tastes like Canadian whiskey. Unfortunately, it's not a taste I usually like. And I actually was hanging out with, I'm going to name drop myself, Dr. Don did like this whole thing for Julio's where it was like a dinner and a whole bunch of different whiskeys to pair. And I managed to convince my wife, who does not like whiskey at all, to come with me, and she enjoyed that night. And the whole time I kept thinking, like, we even had lot 40 cask strength, and yes, that is like one of the better ones that we can get over here. And I still remember being like, this is okay, like better side of okay, but like I wasn't like, oh my god, this is amazing, and that alone, just hearing everybody talk so fondly about that and seeing that it still didn't really wow me, I guess. I don't know. And I'm really not that hard of a sell. But maybe I don't know. It's like I can find the good in most things. I tend to be optimistic, but I just found that I was not overly impressed. But anyway, all right. So let's go ahead and smell this whiskey. The whole point I was getting in is when I was having this last night, I didn't get that smell whatsoever out of this whiskey. That's the whole point of me talking about that.
So I've always described it as kind of a baked pretzel flavor. Okay. And I get it in the other thing I get it in is single grain whiskeys from Scotland.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yep. Absolutely.
Could not tell you exactly what it is, but it's really close. I honestly, it's a funny thing, the language for describing flavors, because that caramel flavor you're talking about and the baked pretzel flavor that I'm talking about is probably the same flavor.
Probably.
It's like, look, if you equate flavor to color, if I say, okay, this is red and this is blue, you know what red is and you know what blue is, and we're speaking the same language. Right. But if I start saying things like this is taupe, or this is, it's like, well, a lot of times people will be like, that's violet. And the other person's like, I think it's blue. It's like, well, you're looking at the same color. You're just using different words to describe it. I get that. And, and I've had some crazy grain whiskeys from Scotland, and some like 50-year-old grains. And there's an Invergordon 1984 that Exclusive Malts did. And I like them. And then it has that note. And I don't like that note. And to be honest with you, we made it a priority to try to weed that out of the profile.
Nice. That's good. I'm actually glad to hear that, because like I know I'm not crazy because I'm not the only person who feels that way, but like knowing that you specifically targeted that to not happen is reassuring to me, I guess, or validating. So
and I think that was part of the point of what we were doing, because we've been looking at some distilleries and brands releasing whiskeys that are old rye. And the fact is that except for like the really old Sazerac and the Handy that come out in the antique collection, like not very many people are making old rye in the United States. If you find an old rye, there's a good chance it's from Canada. It's not just Whistlepig. There are a lot more Canadian rye. And the reason is that the Canadians make basically two styles. They make a flavoring whiskey, which is usually rye, which is either single distilled or it's pot distilled. So it has much higher congener content. It does not have that pretzel note that I don't like either. And then they make what they call base whiskeys, which I think is just a horrible name. And
I know,
I
it
just
just
wish they
kind of
would change the
implies it's not very
nomenclature. It
good.
just implies that it's not very good.
Yeah.
And those they often make from corn, and it's double distilled. And that's often where you find that note. And we rejected samples that had it. We just said, nope, this is not for us, But the funny thing for us with this rye was we were like, we're going to make 100% rye. We said the Canadians have they have this great rye. We're going to make 100% rye, and that's what we're going to make. And we started working with this distillery. And you asked me earlier if I can disclose. Unfortunately, you have to sign an NDA. Basically, whenever you're sourcing, you have to sign an NDA. And I wanted to do all kinds of things to just hint at it, like put the elevation on the bottle somewhere that matches these. And they're like, no, you can't give away what it is. That's disclosing. I was like, shit, okay, fine.
It's like our lawyers are smarter than you. Don't do that.
It's like, that would be a really simple workaround, wouldn't it?
Yeah. That's actually,
it rhymes with,
Right. Yeah. So let me pause you for one second.
Yeah.
Everybody here should have a clue what we're drinking, other than cask strength rye, right? So it's 66% rye, 30% corn, 4% barley, matured in Hungarian oak, no additives, and 57.1% ABV. And I'm getting all of that right off the label. Like, that's awesome. I actually didn't notice the maturation earlier when I was looking at this. I think I was just looking to
put more on there.
What was that?
It looked we wanted to put more information on there, but it looked so damn ugly that we just couldn't do it.
I can see that.
But if you go to on the back, it very much welcomes people to go to foundnorthwhiskey.com /batch001, or just go to or just Google Found North Whiskey. You'll find us. But we really go.
There's a link down in the description too.
Exactly. Oh, awesome. Yeah. That we basically go to lengths to say this is exactly what happened. We even described how we were making it. We wanted to make this 100% rye. And the really interesting thing is, 100% rye is really spicy.
It is, right? Yeah. No, I'm
surprised, right? And I was working with the master blender, and I kept saying, oh, this has all the flavors I like, but it's got this really hot jalapeno black pepper note that I don't know if our consumers are gonna really like. Do you have any rye that tastes just like this without that note? And he was pulling his hair out because he just so and Canadians are notoriously polite, and he was very polite. He was like very polite with me and in saying you're an idiot. And he basically was like but what he pointed out to me, which I thought was really interesting, is Canadians make 100% grain whiskeys because they use, so the reason that there's always a mash bill in bourbon and in rye always has that malted barley content is for the enzymes that will convert starch to sugar for the rest of the grain. You can cultivate and add those enzymes. We just don't do it in the US. They do it in Canada, and it allows them to make 100% corn whiskey, 100% rye whiskey, etc. But one thing that's really interesting about when you do a mash bill, when you do a rye mash bill, that's 51% rye, 39% corn, 10% malted barley, something like you would do in the US. And you're processing all those grains simultaneously. The yield from the corn will be so much higher from an alcohol standpoint that you really aren't drinking a rye. I mean, it's legally a rye, but if you were to take a ton of corn and a ton of rye and distill them separately, you'll get almost twice as much alcohol yield from the corn because the corn has such high starch content. And so what he ended up saying to me was, he was like, you don't really understand, as politely as he could, he was like, Americans stopped making rye. He was like, you guys didn't make rye for 70 years. And you a-holes don't have a clue what it tastes like. It's spicy. And he said, there's a reason why we use, double distilled corn and we blend it in with our batches. And he said, let me just send you some really, really good corn components. And there were some that I didn't like, but he sent us a couple corn components that were so good. They were I was just, and what's really interesting is they're very high proof. And I find that when you when you drink Canadian at a really high proof, when you drink these corn components at a really high proof, it presents less of those flavors that we associate with 40% alcohol by volume Canadian whiskey. It really, strength matters quite a bit. And
Let
so
me pause you for just one second.
yeah.
Sorry. Sam's getting a question. I know that you only just came out with this, so I'm sure the answer is probably no for the moment, but you can see the question up on the screen, right?
Yeah. I'm reading it right now.
Yeah.
Oh man, we made this. We launched this whiskey like 6 weeks ago.
Right.
and what was funny was we allocated a certain amount to Massachusetts,
Mhm.
and we were like, we'll give ourselves about 3 months to sell it into stores. That was our timeline, and we had sold out of our first allocation in 8 days.
I was going to say I have not seen it on the shelves in Julio's.
Yeah. It's selling. We've been selling through it really quite quickly.
That's wonderful.
So it's not available in the UK. It's just becoming available in the rest of the United States. But I would love to be able to make our products available as soon as possible in the UK. They drink a lot more. They drink a wider variety of stuff out there in the UK than I realized. When I would go to Scotland, there's a lot of rum drinkers, a lot of bourbon and rye drinkers. So I'd love to get this out in the UK. Oh, but so
nope, I'm stopping you. I'm thirsty.
Yeah, fire away. Go ahead.
Wow.
Do you want to talk about the whiskey itself, maybe?
Yeah, just in a second. So there's a thunderstorm rolling through. Just in the off chance I lose my power or something, figured I'd let you know.
Okay, got it.
You're welcome to hang out and hold down the fort. Just be like, it's the Nick show.
Man, the solo. That's my dream is to just talk at a blank screen by myself. You'd be surprised how much I'd enjoy that.
I don't think I'd be that surprised.
No.
All right. Well, congrats on the launch of your first whiskey. Many more to come.
Thank you. Cheers.
It just doesn't drink like a Canadian whiskey, and I guess that's the only real the best compliment I can give it. Because I am talking I'm talking to my audience who know how I feel about Canadian whiskey. This drinks like a rye that you would get. What am I trying to say? So I'm trying to even compare it to other ryes that I might have tried, but where it's sticking to me, it does have that significant rye burn, but stay with me for a minute. So whereas you were saying that sometimes the rye can be so much that it's almost unpleasant, there's what I'm assuming is from the corn where it cuts. It's like rising, and then it just cuts and it's super sweet. And I don't know, it's just when you drink this, surprisingly smooth considering the high ABV. Actually, I was talking to some friends last night when I was having this for the first time, and they saw the bottles and they were just like, "What are those?" So I popped them open, which I gotta say, I love wax, but this does have a little bit of the Knob Creek wax effect going on. Where
I know,
yeah, but it's fine. Honestly, it was funny though because I cracked it and it just exploded.
Oh yeah.
But so when I did that, I poured a sip and I was just like, I can't even believe this is cask strength because it just drinks way too smooth. And I'm assuming that's, so long in the barrels just kind of tames it a bit. But I don't know if you can elaborate.
No, 100% no. The rye, no? Okay. Rye, you would think so. The rye components are so damn spicy, and I have them upstairs, and I every time I revisit them, I don't like them on their own. I really don't. And that was the lesson we learned. And that was why that's why it's not 100% rye, because we started blending in the corn. And what's interesting about the corn component is the corn component was aged for 13 years in used oak, and then it was transferred for 7 years into new American oak. Okay. And what will cut that sort of spicy astringency is tannins. So when we think of tannin as being a drying effect, but there's really a difference between tannin and astringency. Okay. Astringency is that sharp burn. And so you're tasting that rising burn. Right. The thing that's cutting that is actually the corn having spent so much time in new oak. It's loaded with tannin. And so it ends up almost dispersing all of the dryness to the rest of the palate. Mm-hmm. It's one of those things where it's like, lying on a bed of nails. You know what I mean?
Right. Yes, I do. Yeah.
If you lay on one nail, it's gonna pierce you. It's gonna hurt like hell.
Mhm.
But if you lie on a bed, you can kind of just even it out, even though it's equal amount of pressure on sort of the same issue.
Right.
I've never used that analogy before, but you
Yeah.
get the idea. And so tannin will actually
It's like
do
drinking
that.
nails.
Yeah, like drinking nails. Cheers.
I will say the oh shoot, I totally forgot what I was gonna say. I don't know. I'm sorry. I had something good to say. I
No
totally
worries.
forget. It's fine.
Yeah, the thing we were really trying to do, and the sweetness is a big component of it too.
Yeah.
What's interesting about the rules that govern making rye in the United States is, and bourbon for that matter, is you have to put it in new oak, right?
Mhm.
You're required to put it in new oak, and if you put these things in new oak for 16 years, 17 years, 20 years.
It tastes like licking a oak stave. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, and so what was very fun about playing with these components was, this is a hard ride to place, and that was the point. That was the excitement for us. A lot of people asked us, like, "You're Americans, why didn't you just go to MGP? You know, they have everything. You know, they've got everything there. It's made to order, and it's a great point. And MGP is awesome. I don't. There's no dogging MGP. I love MGP products. The guys who source from MGP, so much of it, I really am in love with. So don't get me wrong.
I may actually be doing my own thing with MGP, believe it or not.
Hell yes.
Yeah.
Right. And that's awesome. And but what's the challenge about that is, you can't. There are certain flavors in here that you can't get by following the rules that are dictated in the U.S.
Okay.
And the rules that came about in the early 1900s for the U.S. raised the status of American whiskey, undoubtedly. I mean, it elevated, because they were so prescriptive about how you have to make it. The limits on what proof you can distill it to, what proof you can fill it to, has to go in new oak, et cetera, et cetera. It became incredibly prescriptive, which ensured that if you make bourbon and you stamp the title bourbon on it, it's going to be a baseline of quality that's probably higher than any standard anywhere in the world. The problem, of course, is that it narrows the profile.
Yes, completely.
And so for us, what was really exciting was, we can take these barrels and these casks from Canada and take advantage of the way that their rules work to make something that appeals to the American palate. That really does. I mean, I think American whiskey drinkers will love this. The American whiskey drinkers we've poured it for do love it. But at the same time, it presents these fruit notes, these creamy notes, things that you can only get through a lot of years of aging. But then we're able to do that without it having that sort of, licking mulch kind of over oaked flavor.
Not a good flavor. Not a good flavor.
I'm with Jimmy Russell. For me, bourbon is at its best between 8 and 12 years. And that just has to do with how the wood maturation works in Kentucky. Yeah, don't get me wrong. If somebody pours me Pappy 23, I'm not going to be like, no, I don't drink this.
Honestly, no, I will say I was pretty underwhelmed by Pappy 23. Personally,
I like the 15 better.
Yeah. It's funny. I haven't tried the 15. I've only had the 23, which, oh no, poor me.
No.
Yeah. But a buddy of mine, he had, like, I hung out with him one night, and he was just like, hey, by the way, go open that cooler over there. I was like, cooler? Okay. And like, I already had a beer in my hand. I opened it, and he's got like the red velvet bag with the bottle. I didn't actually recognize. I saw it has Pappy on it. I was just like, oh, this must be like the 15 or something.
Right.
And I boom. Like, holy crap. And there was only like that much left. And he's like, I was going to finish it. And then I thought of you, and I know, about the channel. He's like, I didn't feel right not letting you ever try this. and then he proceeds to tell me, he's like, I've got like 10 more bottles in the basement. Because he actually was telling me that he bought it prior to it becoming a thing. And he's like, I've got Pappy Van Winkle. I've got, he has like most of them,
all
right?
the Weller
and different expressions and everything,
all that stuff. Yeah.
And he's like, I have multiple bottles of most of them, and I'm just like, dude, let me know anytime you decide to open one.
Yeah,
Um,
Yeah, seriously.
so back to your concept or what you were saying about being able to make more things up in Canada because of the differences in rules. It's one reason that I'm loving this whole American whiskey concept. That to the moment, American single malt, they're trying to define what it is. I know you probably know about that, but all of the experimentations that just American whiskey in general are doing is wonderful to me. And I kind of hope that they don't settle on a definition all that quick, because I think it's going to,
Yes.
again, stifle creativity. But that's interesting to hear, because I've always thought of Canadian whiskey as being not more limiting, but because there were less rules, and maybe this is just the marketing terms and whatnot getting to me, but because there's less rules, I've always considered it a higher risk of quality. Which makes some sense. I mean, look at what happened is actually pretty much every type of whiskey out there until rules came about is people just poured turpentine and stuff into their whiskeys, so
Exactly.
yeah.
Yeah. And I think what's really, when you look at the history of Canadian and American whiskey, they basically operated in conjunction largely because of Seagrams. Basically the, Seagrams owned 10 distilleries in the US and 4 distilleries in Canada, and they owned everything. I mean, everything, right? And
Right.
basically, Seagrams was ubiquitous with whiskey. They owned Glenlivet at one point. I mean, where do you think MGP comes from? This is one of the funniest things to me. Is like people think, oh, right, like American whiskey is so different from Canadian whiskey. MGP, which is responsible for so many brands and so many different whiskeys. Why is it that there's this random distillery in Lawrenceburg, Indiana that makes every style possible of whiskey? It used to be a Seagram's plant, right? Like, where do you think it was literally the trend of making blended whiskey. I mean, Four Roses was a blend. It only became a straight bourbon.
That blew my mind when I first learned about that.
It only
Actually,
became a straight
about as
bourbon
much as
because
back to
sorry,
to
go ahead.
No, it's fine. Back when you were talking about Whistle Pig is like when I don't remember how long ago that was, but let's say within my first 30 videos, I did Whistle Pig, and it was the 8 year. And I remember reading that and just being like, oh, cool, a whiskey from Vermont, and then reading up on it and be like, oh, a whiskey from Canada,
Right.
And I don't know. By the way, just going back a little while, I remembered what I was trying to remember.
Yes.
Specifically about the layering of this whiskey was, as I was mentioning, it's rising with the rye and then it gets cut a bit with the corn, but layering in whiskey, I imagine, has to be extremely difficult to actually pull off because most people don't do it or can't do it. And it is always just a wonderful thing when it happens to me. I can think of actually multiple scotches where they do that well, but I can't think of too many. I'm certainly not Canadians, but I can't even think of that many bourbons or really anything in America that isn't maybe an American single malt. So I'm curious, just with your experience, is that, I mean, you have only 4% barley in here. I imagine the layering is more just, I don't know. Like, what do you figure makes that happen?
Layering is incredibly difficult. And honestly, one of the big advantages that we have is one of the guys on our team, Sammy Karachi, his background is mixology. Mm-hmm. And as a result, he always talked about flavor in such a theoretical and interesting way with me, particularly when he was teaching me to appreciate cocktails, because I was just a jerk when it came to cocktails for the longest time. I was just why would you waste good whiskey, any good whiskey, in a cocktail, right? And that was my attitude until I met Sammy. Yeah. And then he just educated me. But he used to talk about flavors, and he basically would say, like, a really good cocktail, you shouldn't be able to pick out flavors. Right. It should be in harmony, but it should transition. Right. It shouldn't just hit one note and stay. Mm-hmm. And that idea was always baffling to me. It was like, okay, how can you not pick out specific flavors? But at the same time, and what he really meant was, like, you shouldn't be able to taste the components. You shouldn't be able to taste vermouth and whiskey and notice specific things about those. So they should come together to create a certain flavor, but then a really good cocktail will progress. Well, when we started making a blend, that was what we really wanted to make a layered whiskey. We wanted to make a whiskey that was worth pouring a second time. Mm-hmm. that's to me.
I've poured this one several times at this point.
Good. Yeah, no, but
Yeah.
I mean, like, for me, a whiskey that's really, really a great pour is one where the second you finish the glass, you're not like, what else you got on the shelf here? You know what I mean? It's like, wait, can you pour that again? Because it was evolving as I was drinking it.
Well,
You know, that's cool.
Speaking of pouring, so two things, just because I want to make sure we get to everything too, and
I talk a lot.
No, it's okay. Like I said, I love listening to you talk because I always learn stuff, and that's a big reason why I keep having you on too. Other than I just kind of like you, but it's like I want the viewers to be able to learn from you too. So, all right, for those of you that joined recently, so Nick Taylor, one of my favorite guests to have on the show, he started up his own with his brother, his own brand called Found North, and they're making premium cask strength whiskeys from Canada, trying to change some of the perspective that we in America typically have of Canadian whiskeys. So far, off to a good start. So we just finished, or not finished, we'll probably go back to it, the cask strength rye, which is 66% rye, 30% corn, 4% barley, aged in, or matured in Hungarian oak, and that's 57.1. Now, the other one that we're going to probably jump into right now, because I can't wait again, this is Nick and I were talking about this. So first off, let me tell you what's in this. This is 80% corn, 19% rye, 1% barley, which is funny to bother. I'm sure there's a good reason for that. Just put a little drop in there. And then it's matured in ex-wheated bourbon, 64.9%, which is also why we did this one second, because otherwise this would be probably turn into a different kind of stream. So I was asking Nick earlier today, because this is a Canadian whiskey and it's 80% corn, what kind of classification would you even give this? And go for it.
Yeah. So I'm not even sure I would be allowed to call it a Canadian whiskey. I believe Canadian whiskey has to actually be bottled in Canada. I'm not positive about that, but I'm pretty sure. And we bottled this in Brooklyn. And actually, Sammy and his wife did the bottling, every single bottle themselves, including the wax top. So if you have a problem, just let Sammy. No, I'm kidding.
I'm definitely gonna. No, you know what I'm gonna do? I'm gonna send her a picture of Knob Creek and just say, you know what you did.
No, they bottled this. It was a 5-day operation, like 12 hours a day of bottling. Starting your own brand is you gotta find ways to save money.
How many bottles did you do right off the bat? Like how many did you start with?
1,300 of each, roughly.
How many?
13 and change. 1,300 and change of each. Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
And basically, the Found North batch 2 was hilarious because we wanted to make a rye. We wanted to make another rye. We had the rye component in here was aged in ex-wheated bourbon barrels, and it was awesome. It was actually a 17-year. There's a small component, a tiny percentage of this is 16-year. So that's actually why they're both 16 years. But the 17-year ex-wheated bourbon aged rye, right? Just like a mouthful. But this component was unbelievable. It was creamy and minty at the same time. It presented just a little bit of like good wheated bourbon flavor, the rye component itself. And we had this 20-year corn sample that we very affectionately call sample 18, because you get these samples sent to you and they have these like crazy long codes on them, and so we just Sharpie the bottles 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Ignore the codes.
Makes sense.
And so sample 18, which literally wasn't even the sample number that it was sent to us, but sample 18 was this corn component that was mind-boggling. It was so good. and so we said, okay, we're going to blend this ex-wheated rye component with this corn component. And the problem was, the more we went in favor of the corn, the better the whiskey got. And we eventually hit the inflection point where it was at 50-50. And we said, okay, should we try this at 60-40 in favor of the corn? And it was better. And we tried it at 70-30, and it was even better. And we tried it at 80-20, and we said, this is where it's perfect. But it's no longer a rye. It's not a Canadian whiskey. What the hell? How are we going to sell this thing? And we were like, this is going to have no sticker value. People are going to come in and be like, what is cask strength whiskey from Canada that's corn? Like what is this thing? But basically, it's funny. Earlier you said, were Americans making Canadian whiskey and sort of trying to change the perception.
Right.
We're trying to change the perception not as a mission, out of necessity. We made the best whiskey we could make. Period. Then we tried to make then we started working on what people think about it. Right. It's like,
right.
But it was very much a let the whiskey dictate. Let the whiskey dictate. Period. Whatever tastes best is what we're going to bottle. Which is also why it ended up being. It was very funny because we had an older rye component. We had an 18-year rye component that we could have blended instead of the 16-year rye component, and it's a tiny percentage. And that would have allowed us to have a 16-year and a 17-year. And like create some discrepancy.
No, that makes sense. Yeah.
And we still just said, nope, it's better with this 16-year component. We don't care that it lowers our age statement by a year.
Yeah.
Screw it. It's just better this way.
To be honest, I like that they're both 16 because it makes it look like it was done on purpose.
It was not.
Well, that's fine, but batch 3 better be 16 years.
So. Batch 3 will not be 16 years, and batch 4 and batch 5. Batch 4 and batch 5 won't either. We've been working on that. We've been blending like maniacs for the last couple of weeks, which is always super fun. It's slightly less fun than you would think. Like you're like, oh yeah, people all the time are like, you get up and you drink all day. That sounds like a great job.
Right.
It's like,
yeah.
Did you ever go on spring break? Like when you got to day 7 of spring break, all you want to do is go home and drink water. Right.
You just want you want to drink water and eat like a croissant.
yeah. I mean, it took 9 months of blending to get this thing right.
Wow.
And like drinking whiskey every day, it is very fun, but it's more taxing than you would think. But basically we made this and we finally said, we don't even know what to call it. We just submitted it as cask strength whiskey and the TTB was fine with that. And we just said, screw it. We'll put the origin on there, the mash bill, the maturation, and period. Right. Like people can take it for what it is and drink it and decide if they like it. And that'll be enough. But a lot of people on Instagram and even people email us and say, we love your rye, but we like the bourbon even more. It's not bourbon. It would never qualify as bourbon for a bunch of reasons. It wasn't, number one, it wasn't made in America. But number two, the corn components are distilled to a higher proof than is actually legally allowed in the U.S. You can't distill above 180 in the U.S. These are the corn components are actually distilled above 180, which for me was a massive red flag, and it's why I needed I would say my handheld, but really I needed my throat throttled by this master blender to even start engaging with the corn components, which was just because I always believed, period, that the more congeners, the better. And the higher the proof you distill it up to, the less congeners you have. Right. Period. Right. The more it's ethanol. And he just walked me through it. And he said, people think that the way you make whiskey is like, you take the grain, you take the wood, you slap it together, you have whiskey. Right. You get flavors from the grain, you get flavors from the wood. But they're missing the most important component, which is the oxygen. The oxygen reacts with everything, and that's what develops all the flavors. And the oxygen will react with whatever is most present. So what's really interesting about the corn component in batch 2 is it's 20 years old, and it spent 13 years in used oak before being transferred into new oak for 7 years. And so for 13 years, a lot of the top notes develop. So esters, a lot of the esters are developing simply because because you water it down and then you let it interact with oxygen rather than wood, right? Because wood's got sugar and lignans and tannins and all these things that are super, super reactive. And so if you put whiskey into new oak, you destroy any opportunity for it to develop these esters early on. Right. And so we have 13 years of ester development. Then they put it in the new oak, and then it developed all of these other flavors. And so it just ended up being much better and more dynamic than I really would have imagined something double distilled would be.
Yeah, that seems super backwards, which I mean, like after your explanation makes a little bit more sense, but I would say not backwards, counterintuitive, like everybody makes such a big deal about new charred oak barrels, right? And that's what gives it all of its flavor. But you bring up an interesting point about giving it time to do what it's doing in a used oak barrel.
In a more neutral environment.
I'm making a note to research that myself.
I will send you we've read Dr. Don's dissertation like 6 times each. It is honestly, if you want to understand wood maturation at like a really at a post-grad level, try reading it. I mean, it's barely in English as far as I'm concerned, because there's so many chemical compounds in there, but it really was illuminating about this is how we develop certain flavors. And one of the cool things about Canadian is, during fermentation, like certain grains are optimized at a certain pH and a certain temperature. So if you put all the grains in the fermentation tank, if you ferment them all simultaneously, you're actually compromising, because it's not optimized really for any of them. And that's one of the reasons, like, people think, okay, what is an ester, right? Like, we talk about esters. Oh, this has so much esters, and nobody knows what the hell an ester actually is.
It's so estery.
Yeah. Like, people talking about whiskey, they're like, oh, the esters in here are beautiful. It's like, you don't know that. Okay, wait, hold on. But basically, like, you're developing your esters by combining certain types of alcohol with certain types of acid. And certain types of acids only develop, and certain types of alcohols only develop in very specific conditions. And by actually separating the grains when they make the whiskey, they're able to control the esterification process to an incredible precision, which is one of the reasons why I think
esterification. Like, I'm calling you out. I don't think that's a real word.
Esterification was very much a real word.
But Nick is full of crap. No, I'm just kidding. Hey, let's have a sip of this before.
Let's have a sip of this, and I'll tell you
it's just creamy, just so creamy. And despite the 80%, although it's sweet, I mean, like, you would not mistake that this has quite a bit of corn component. But I don't think I would put it at 80% because the rye is still so prevalent. And yeah, it's actually, you know what it does? It's the opposite of the other whiskey. And here's what I mean by that for everybody that's not just you and me. So with the first whiskey, completely at like the center and tip of my tongue, it was just rye, and it was like building, and then it got sweet, like I told you, and it kind of cut it, and then it was nice. This one was sweet on the tongue immediately, and then it was hot in my throat. So it was like it just reversed. It went from the start to the finish to the finish to the start. It was very interesting. There's a reason that we did this in this order.
Yes. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But that's really cool. I think if you nose this, you recognize bourbon-y characteristics, like just like you said, right? Like you realize there's a big corn factor in here. And you get new oak, you get caramel and new oak and things like that, right? But I think, like, when we nosed this, we kept finding a lot of fruit notes, a lot of like melon and apple and things that you would find in an old Scotch that's had years of oxidation. And that's really where you start to develop all those crazy fruit notes. And having that in a American style whiskey is what I would call it. It's obviously not an American whiskey. We sometimes just call it a North American whiskey. Having it in a North American whiskey is fun. I mean, that's the bottom line. Like, it's fun. It shows age, it shows caramel, it shows corn, it shows the things we like in bourbon, but it just pushes. And it was very interesting when we were blending both of these, because I basically said, you don't want to be so far outside the flavor map that people don't recognize what you are. It was like Whiskey Advocate published an Australian single malt as their best whiskey of the quarter last summer. So it was like an 8-year, $300 Australian single malt. And I got to taste it at Norfolk Wine and Spirits, and Bikram poured it for me. And he was like, what do you think? It tasted so different from any single malt I'd ever had that it was really hard to plate. It's like, do you like it or not? Like, it's like, I don't even know what it is. You know what I mean? Like, it's so different from what I'm used to that it's hard to even recognize it as something that I can compare it to. It's like, how does it compare to Kleinlich. It doesn't taste anything even remotely like Kleinlich.
Right.
So you
Plus,
want to push
if you're just
edge.
doing like a sample, you're only like, if you told me to tell you
Yes.
everything that I could about this whiskey in that little, I'd be like, it's good. You know,
it's good. Yeah,
right.
I don't know.
Yeah, man. Like,
so for us, we were trying to push. We were trying to like push the boundaries a little, but not get so far outside of recognition. You know what I mean? Where you're like, all right, I can't even place what this is.
Yeah, you know, and I think like Balcones is doing some of that stuff where they're doing things that are just totally out there, and people love them for it. But I have to think those bottles aren't flying off the shelves either. You know, some of them anyway. But
I don't know. I think Balcones is has been pretty successful. But Balcones is a bullseye for what I'm talking about. Yeah. Balcones is it's really cool, but it's like, I don't know what you are. You know what I mean? Like, I don't, not even like, obviously it's stated what it is, but like, I've never tasted anything like you. And that's cool in and of itself, but it makes it really hard to say, like, where does this fit in the lexicon of, you know, bourbons I've had or single malts I've had or whatever. It's like, oh, I like it, but I just don't know what it is, you know? And we really didn't want to get into that sphere where it's like, people who drink bourbon are like, yeah, I like this thing because I see there's some corn in it, but it tastes so far. It's in the realm of what you'd expect from an aged bourbon, but it just does a few things differently, which I think
completely,
is really
I like that description of it. Like, when I drink this, as I mentioned, it's creamy and it tastes like what corn does to whiskey, among other things like the rye, everything I mentioned. But I would not taste this and say this tastes like a quintessential bourbon, you know, at all.
Yeah.
It doesn't have a lot of the similar notes that you would get. Like, it doesn't taste like the inside of an oak barrel, you know, and it doesn't taste like, it doesn't have, I want to say it doesn't, hold on. I need another sip.
Go back. Yeah. Keep revisiting.
Because I don't want to say something that's wrong. Because what I was going to say is it doesn't have as much of a caramel flavor as a lot of bourbons do, but it actually kind of does. After the second sip. Now, I've gone back and forth a couple times, so I could be mixing things up. But I want to stop for just one sec because we only have about 5 minutes left. I want to cut at about 9 o'clock or so because Jason from the Mash and Drum, by the way, anybody watching, I'm sure you guys are going to go over and watch him right after this. But I want to give you a chance to just kind of 2 questions, lightning round kind of thing.
Yes,
one thing that I'm dying to know. So on the side of the bottle, there's what appears to be a topographical map here.
Yes.
Where is that?
Nowhere.
Okay.
Nowhere.
It did look a little insane. I'm like, what is this, like the Himalayas or something? You know?
Yeah. So. No, actually, we looked at the topographical area around the distillery, and it was too boring for that to be. And so we had an idea for what we want it to be, and then we told the designer, put it together, and it was a little not as crazy as this, and we said no, we want it crazier. And I really wanted all the little trail lines.
Yeah. Oh yeah, I didn't notice those actually. I like that. That would be a heck of a hike, man. For us, whiskey both as consumers and makers is very much an exploration. You know, that's a big thing for us, and so it's just it's a theme, it's a feeling that we wanted to convey when you drink it. So yeah, that was the only thing I contributed to the design process was I was into the dotted lines and I wanted wax tops. Okay. Well, I like the silver. It reminds me of Booker's 30th. So,
hey, I'll take it.
Right.
All right. What's the second one? I want the second question.
So the second question is, why Found North? Was it just referencing to Canada, or is there more to it?
Yeah, two things. One, we wanted to be. I think there were a couple ideas in that. One was we wanted to be very plain about this. Mm-hmm. We didn't make this. We don't pretend like we distilled it. Right. Mm-hmm. This is not grandma's famous recipe that we're recreating. We found this whiskey north of the border, right? It's found north. But there's also the idea of discovering what's up there. Mm-hmm. You know, I think there's something exciting for American whiskey drinkers who are excited about whiskey and want to drink something that's different. But nobody really, other than Canada, nobody makes whiskey like American whiskey, right? Mm-hmm. Like single malt is everywhere. It's in Israel. It's in Taiwan. It's everywhere, right? Yeah. But you don't see them making some bourbon variant in France.
Yeah, so, that is a little strange. I wonder why. Yeah, maybe just because it's hard to compete with, I guess. But
I guess. So it was exciting. There's exciting. but there's also this idea of like we talk about like finding your own north, right? It's like just finding the thing that gets you jacked up, finding the thing that really just find your own north, right? Like find something that is the pinnacle for yourself. That's really exciting for you. And honestly, like when we made this whiskey, we had lost all our contracts, all the deals we had been doing, we couldn't do because we were an education and tasting company.
Yeah.
Every employee on our team took a pay cut in order to do this. And it was a big deal for us to take a big risk on this. We invested every dollar we've saved for the last 4 years in buying supplies of this. You can't just walk in and say like, hey, I'd like to buy 3 barrels to companies that have hundreds of thousands of barrels. They tell you, piss off. Right. And so for us, this is the part of it was just like, find the thing that inspires you, find your north. So that was the sort of the origin of the name. It took 2 months to name it. It took a long time to come up with a name. That was one of the hardest parts.
Naming things is often the one of the hardest parts. Yeah. Well, I wish you all the luck. For anybody here who's interested, I mean, I'll tell you right now, my favorite is definitely the rye over the other one. I like them both a lot, but just because you guys watch me, if your palate tends to line up more with mine, go for this one for sure. Or buy them both, do Nick a favor. But they are premium, I mean, they're not $20. So you can find links to both of them in the description of this video. I very much encourage you to do this, not just because I like Nick, but because this, especially that first one, but really both of them, that layering that they're both doing is something that you don't get a lot. And it's something that excites me as somebody who's probably reviewed like 300 whiskeys on this channel. So like, that's awesome. And you did an awesome job doing this, making this whiskey. So, or you know what I mean? Yeah, I mean, awesome. You did a great job.
Yeah, the one other thing, Bill, thank you so much for having me. Guys, if you have any questions, email me at nick@foundnorthwhiskey.com. I love answering whiskey questions.
Yeah, he
I'll
certainly
talk to
does.
you on the phone. Like, just hit me up. I'm happy to keep talking about our whiskey or about anything whiskey. So, Bill, thank you so much, man.
Yeah, no problem. Actually, you know what I'll do? If you're game for it, which I'm sure you will be. So I mentioned earlier that I'm going to be probably doing a whiskey as well. So we just picked one earlier this week. Actually, it's from it's from 3 Chord, which is a fairly new.
Very cool.
Yeah, and I'm doing it through Julio's. I'll have everything up, whatever. But when that comes out, actually, maybe I'll send you a bottle and we'll meet up again and just talk whiskey. And I think that'd be really fun. So.
I'd have a blast. Yeah, that would be so much fun.
I'm gonna say I'm gonna go out on a limb here. I think it tastes a lot like the Remus Repeal Special. What is it? Remus Repeal Reserve number 4 that I have up there, which shocked me. Like, there's no reason it should taste that good. And I tried like 6-7 of these things, and then it was just like, that's the one. So I can only imagine. Yeah. I was hoping that we would get to the whole fatigue thing. We'll have to talk to it another time.
We'll have to talk about it another time. It takes me an hour to describe it anyway, so we need a whole nother. Just Nick on palate fatigue is the next one. Yeah,
that sounds perfect. It'll just be your tongue.
Yeah, seriously.
All right. Well, thank you everybody for joining. Nick, thanks again for coming on, and let me know, how you do, and if batch 3 comes out, you're welcome back.
Oh, baby. Batch 3 is coming out this year, so we'll be back.
Fantastic. So we'll talk soon. All right, man. Bye, everybody.
Thanks,